We will now start this session, a session organized by the Sana'a Center on implications of the Red Sea conflict on Yemen and the region. Thank you all for attending this session. Please note that this session will be in both English and Arabic. Interpretation in both languages will be available. You can use the interpretation by clicking on the globe icon to select the language that you would like to listen to. The speakers for today will be Abdulghani Al-Iryani, Senior Researcher at the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies, Taimur Khan, Head of Regional Operations for the Gulf at CAR, the Conflict Armament Research Center, and we are supposed to also be joined by Ambassador Andbrahan W. Georges, an Eritrean diplomat and independent expert on democratic governance, conflict resolution, and preventative diplomacy. Also with us is Mustafa Nasr, head of the Studies of an Economic Media Center, and I am Mesa Shuja'ad-Din, a senior researcher at the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies. Welcome everyone to this session. This session comes against the backdrop of the airstrikes conducted by the United States and the United Kingdom on Houthi sites in Yemen in the early hours of Friday, the 22nd of January. These airstrikes came in response to a series of attacks conducted by the Houthis in which they targeted commercial shipping vessels in the Red Sea, in what they considered to be a response to the Israeli military campaign in Gaza. The British and American airstrikes targeted sites and governorates of Sana'a, Sa'da, Hajjah, Hudayadh, and Taiz. In response, the Houthis pledged to retaliate, and they indeed carried out an attack on an American destroyer 24 hours or 2 days ago. These American and British airstrikes came after the formation of an international coalition led by the United States in December of last year. The purpose of this coalition is to counter Houthi attacks. Furthermore, these airstrikes followed the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 2722 on the 10th of January, which demanded an immediate cessation of Houthi attacks which have compelled many major shipping companies to avoid the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, through which approximately 15% of global maritime trade and 10% of oil shipments pass. These vessels had been rerouted towards the Cape of Good Hope, which has had negative implications on the Yemeni and global economies. The current Houthi strikes are hitting a very sensitive area and a cause that enjoys significant popular support, namely the Palestinian cause. This cause has substantial popular backing both in the region and in Yemen, which has given the Houthis unprecedented popular momentum in the midst of growing regional and international public anger over the continuation of this war. These attacks, however, will remain costly for Yemenis, who will bear a heavy price, especially in a country that has been suffering from a war for over 9 years and is also experiencing near-famine conditions in some areas. Welcome, everyone. We will start with Abdulghani Al-Iryani, who will tell us more about who the Houthis are, what their motives are, and what impact this has on Yemen, whether on the potential peace agreement that was expected to be announced at the end of last year, or on the Yemeni war in general. Go ahead, Mr. Abdulghani. Thank you very much, and welcome all. I apologize for the delay. I will start by providing our non-Yemeni participants or listeners a definition of Ansar Allah. The Houthis are an extremist Zaydi group. They are also an armed movement. And the most important element in their ideology is their belief in the concept of supremacy, which means that Allah has chosen them, the Ahl al-Bayt or the descendants of the Prophet, to govern, and that all others should be followers and supporters of them. Perhaps the best expression of this idea came from the late President Saleh al-Sammad when he met leading figures of the General People's Congress in 2014 after Ansar Allah took control of Sana'a. He told them, "I want you to know where our beliefs start. We believe that Allah created us only to empower the Ahl Bayt. This belief might help in understanding how the Houthis act and their basis on the principles of empowerment or support and supremacy, asserting that they have the right to rule over others, while others are only obliged to follow and submit to them." Some may ask about the motivations or the incentives that prompted Ansar Allah to close maritime navigation for Israeli ships or those linked to Israel. Mesa has presented figures indicating the volume of trade that was said to have been disrupted as a result of the actions of Ansar Allah. Before discussing the incentives of Ansar Allah, I wanted to clarify something that I believe must be clear. It was not the Houthis who stopped most of the trade in the Red Sea. Rather, it was stopped due to political pressure that was exerted on the shipping companies. For example, Maersk, around 1% of its vessels that pass through the Red Sea go to the port city of Eilat. However, it suspended all of its activities in the Red Sea, and that, in my opinion, is so that Israel is not the only one being besieged. These are political objectives, and those responsible for them are not Ansar Allah. I believe that it was due to American and European pressure that led to this significant amount of trade and activity in the Red Sea being stopped. The intentions of the Houthis and the incentives that drove them to their actions. First, we need to acknowledge that this action stems from an ideological commitment for them. For the past 20 years, they've been chanting death to America, death to Israel, and now they see this as the moment where they must act on these beliefs. They are also aware that the Yemeni people are highly supportive of the Palestinian cause, perhaps even more so than any other Arab population with the exception of Jordan. The Yemeni people expect that Ansar Allah will take this action, and Ansar Allah have made significant political gains internally in Yemen, regionally, and internationally. However, the matter is not just a response to the Yemeni public. There are also some important political reasons for this. Ansar Allah are member of the Axis of Resistance, which declared the unity of its various fronts, meaning that the different fronts it operates in, Yemen, Gaza, Hezbollah, Syria, and Iraq, and Iran, will act as a unified front. Iran was in need of a significant action when the genocide in Gaza started. It had to commit to doing something significant, and it had to decide whether in doing this it would rely on Hezbollah or Ansar Allah. In my opinion, Hezbollah is Tehran's first line of defense, not Gaza's first line of defense, and it cannot be sacrificed for Gaza. On the other hand, Ansar Allah, for several reasons, can be dispensable if they were to be dismantled as a result of this action. Ansar Allah themselves, this does not mean that Ansar Allah take these orders from Iran. They are not Iranian proxies or agents, but rather allies. However, a significant portion of the Ansar Allah movement has adopted the 12er Shia sect, and their loyalty has shifted to Khamenei instead of being to Abdulmalik al-Houthi, or at least having allegiance to both. And this is one of the reasons that led them to take this course of action. Moreover, they're actually more capable of enduring this strike. Yemen is a large country in area, and there are no compelling sites for the United States and its allies to conduct airstrikes. They also have significant armaments. Even if some of it were to be destroyed, they can continue to hinder navigation for months. They also believe that I think that they believe this is their final battle, even if it inflicts damage on their military capabilities. Even if that were to happen, they would politically benefit from it, and the potential weakening of their military capabilities would not hinder reaching an agreement with Saudi Arabia and for them to gain significant concessions from them. This takes us to the peace process itself. You might be surprised when I say that the Houthi intervention in the Red Sea saved them from themselves. This is because they negotiated from a position of power with Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia made significant concessions to them at the expense of the other Yemeni parties. This led to a significant imbalance between the two sides, between the Houthis and the anti-Houthi camp, so that when they do sit down at a negotiating table, the Houthis will not offer the other side sufficient concessions to achieve a balanced and sustainable peace. Therefore, it is highly likely that the negotiations that were supposed to follow the announcement of the war ending in Saudi Arabia, with this having been scheduled for December but has been temporarily postponed, would have resulted in the complete disintegration of the Yemeni state. It is true that the Houthis control a large part or most of northern Yemen, and they control state institutions as well as more than 2/3 of the population. However, these are not the pillars of a state, of a sustainable state. And their state is not viable because the Yemeni state, even before 2011, had already been showing signs of collapse and a lack of sustainability. At that time, the Yemeni state was no longer viable. So imagine now if that state, which was in that state at that point, has now been divided into several parts, and each part must continue to mobilize and arm itself to fight against the others. Therefore, neither the Houthi state nor the state that the Transitional Council expects to declare at some point, nor the state that people expect to be established in Hadramaut. And this means that the likeliest option is the complete disintegration of the Yemeni state after the war. Now, after this action, I think that things have changed. At the beginning of last year, I had sensed from my communication that the Americans and the Saudis had come to accept the idea of Ansar Allah being the dominant force in Yemen. I don't know how they could have believed that Yemen could be a state under Houthi control, because The majority of areas that are not currently under their control would not accept them. Taiz, for example, cannot accept being a part of a Houthi-led state. Additionally, I believe that the Houthis cannot accept having 6 million Shafi'is as a part of their state or altering the demographic balance within their territories. The Southern Transitional Council, or Southerners in general, would have pursued secession. What that means is that what has changed and what has made the Saudis and the Americans reconsider and believe that maybe the Yemeni state needs to be a balanced partnership among all parties, so that these actors are the ones who will prevent the Houthis from endangering regional stability. Perhaps now, if the Saudis and Americans are still serious about the peace process, we have an opportunity to maintain Yemen as a unified state with a balance between the powers. Thank you very much. Back to you, Mesa. Thank you very much, Abdul Ghani. We will now move over to Taimur Khan.
Mr. Taimur Khan, the floor is yours. Can you clarify to us the Houthi military capabilities and the smuggling network and the Iranian support for the Houthis?
Yeah, thank you, Mesa, for the introduction and for the invitation. And very helpfully sending some guiding questions that I can try to answer. I'll do my best to provide some kind of broad answers to these questions about the Houthi military capabilities and kind of how they are able to receive these weapons. And then maybe in the Q&A, if people have more detailed questions, I'd be happy to ask them. Just quickly on my organization, Conflict Armament Research, we investigate illicit weapon supply chains. And we do this through kind of field work, boots on the ground approach. So we go into conflict zones with national partners and document material that they've recovered from various groups. We've been working in Yemen since 2017, documenting Houthi material as well as material from weapons used by terrorist groups and smugglers. In terms of Houthi military capabilities, again, I won't kind of delve into everything, but I think the most relevant and strategic aspect of their military capabilities are, clearly the guided weapons, so the missiles and their drone arsenal. And so their guided weapon arsenal includes cruise missiles, both for attacking targets on land, but also clearly anti-ship systems, as well as ballistic missiles, both for on-land attacks and to target ships. They also have kind of air defense guided weapons, and of course drones, which were kind of the focus of work on the Houthis up until now, I would say. These systems are always becoming more sophisticated, accurate, capable. They're in most part Iranian supplied and designed systems, unless they are kind of legacy missiles that have been repurposed and upgraded. So systems that the Yemeni armed forces had in their stockpile before 2014. I think everyone's been very surprised by the volume or the depth of the stockpile of these systems. Clearly, the interdictions and the material that we've seen stopped from going into Yemen to the Houthis was just a snapshot of the overall picture. In addition to the missiles and the drones themselves becoming more sophisticated, more accurate, the TTPs are the ways that these systems are used together in attacks on shipping. We've seen now have become much more complex. We saw that only in limited ways against static targets on land during the Yemen conflict, where drones and missiles were used together. But now we're seeing drones, ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles used in the same attack. So I think that's quite interesting as well. The missile systems that we've seen used to target maritime commercial shipping in the Red Sea over recent weeks. We don't know exactly what systems are being used, but from the Houthi recent military parades, we have a kind of good idea of what is in their arsenal. And it's clear there was a concerted effort to specifically build up their anti-ship capabilities over time by their allies. in terms of the smuggling networks and how they're able to, surprisingly perhaps have such a large stockpile. I mean, the overall dynamics are well known. We've worked on these for a number of years, but essentially the supplies that are coming from Iran are smuggled in dhows, some typically operated by Somali networks that are kind of transporting small arms and light weapons, ammunition, explosive precursors. Other maritime networks, Yemeni and Iranian, bring more sophisticated systems. So parts of missiles, components, engines, guidance kind of modules or kits used in the missiles and drones. There's also overland smuggling. We've seen drone components, missiles, other items, other material used by the Houthis that are kind of hidden in illicit cargo and make their way through the overland into the country. And we've also seen diversion of commercial explosives from illicit networks as well. So kind of a corruption of legal supply chains. And we've worked on all of these different dynamics, but in particular, the maritime networks, we believe they've stayed active over the past year, but there haven't been any major interdictions until this week's seizure by U.S. naval forces of missile components headed for the Houthis. And that's the first major interdiction in almost a year, which is also quite interesting. Again, these seizures are just a snapshot of what the Houthis are able to acquire from outside of Yemen. In terms of Iranian support, it's Iranian material support on the military side is pretty clear cut. I mean, over the past 6 or 7 years, we have documented everything from small arms and light weapons, so rifles, larger caliber weapons, anti-tank guided missiles, kits used in the construction of improvised explosive devices, chemical precursors used to manufacture explosives, everything from that to, again, missiles and drones, and key components used in drones, which I'll talk a little bit more about. The Houthis have also been able to, I just wanted to add that we've seen an evolution in the Houthi drone capabilities, in particular, kind of a hybrid design where, rather than the whole system being supplied, from the allies, Houthis are able to manufacture parts of these systems domestically, and then the key internal components used for navigation and targeting are still supplied from abroad. But however, in some of the more recent attacks in the Red Sea, we've seen drone systems used that do not look like they were made locally, but much more like fully made Iranian systems, which is also interesting and perhaps another index of the level of support from Iran. In terms of what I mentioned about the domestic manufacture by the Houthis, or let's say greater resilience in their supply chains for these strategic systems, the model that we've documented over time, again, are key components being supplied externally, which are quite, probably easier to smuggle into the country than full drones. But airframes made locally, Houthis are able to procure some of the mechanical, less sophisticated components, including small engines, the materials used to manufacture the airframes of some of the drones themselves. And the best example of that are the main attack drones that the Houthis used during the course of the war, the Qasif and Samad systems. Similar dynamic with missiles, but I think these are more sophisticated, more frequently supplied as full systems. I think I'll leave it there, Mesa, and take some questions in the Q&A for more detail.
Thank you very much, Taimur. Okay. We'll move now to the ambassador and the Burhan Georges. I'm sorry for my pronunciation if not correct. Can you give us some details about the Red Sea security and why all the Red Sea states they didn't participate in this U.S. coalition, in particular the major countries, Saudi Arabia and Egypt.
Thank you, Mesa, and hello, everybody. I'm pleased to participate in this distinguished panel. Well, by way of introduction, let me set the Red Sea security in context. The Red Sea, as we all know, straddles the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula and links the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea via the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb and the Canal Suez. The Red Sea Basin, formed by both flanks, embraces 8 countries: Egypt, Sudan, Eritrea, and Djibouti on the western or African side, and Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen on the eastern or Asian side. The geostrategic and geoeconomic importance impacts the geopolitics of both the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. Its geostrategic and economic importance then enables it to reach or to extend beyond the geographic limits or beyond its geographic limits. And the rich mineral deposits on both flanks, on the continental shelves on both sides, also attracts global competition and fuels volatility. And of course, recently, growing geopolitical rivalry, especially between China and the US, aggravates regional volatility. As a vital maritime route of global merchant vessels and navy ships, the Red Sea holds considerable strategic, economic, and commercial importance. Its southwestern coast in the Horn of Africa hosts the military and naval presence of several world and regional powers. Let me mention some figures to show the critical importance of the Red Sea to global trade. On average, 386 ships navigate the Red Sea per day. That makes about 141,000 per year. This is according to Lloyd's List Intelligence. Annually, about 15% of world maritime trade, 10% of all seaborne oil, US $1 trillion worth of merchandise pass through the Red Sea and pass through the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb and generate tolls of about $9.4 billion. On the western flank of the Red Sea, the Horn of Africa is characterized by a complex interstate and intrastate conflict matrix with constantly shifting alliances or alignments at the local and global forces. We all follow the crisis in Sudan, Ethiopia, and of course Somalia, and the troubled relations or Ethiopia's troubled relations with neighbors, with all its maritime Red Sea littoral states, that's Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia, Sudan, and Kenya. On the southeastern flank, there prevails a fragile peace in a politically fragmented Yemen, with 3 rival forces: the Supreme Political Council, the SPC, the Presidential Leadership Council, the PLC, and the Southern Transitional Council, the STC, dominating different parts of the country. There exist pockets of territory under Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and the Islamic State. Furthermore, there is the Red Sea Forum, the RSF, a regional grouping of 8 Red Sea and Gulf of Aden littoral states, namely Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Djibouti, Somalia, Eritrea, Egypt, Yemen, and Jordan. The Red Sea Forum has been set to promote economic cooperation, cultural exchanges, and of course address environmental and security issues concerning the Red Sea. With the war in Gaza, the Houthi, or Ansar Allah, have launched attacks on international shipping in the southern Red Sea, targeting particularly those involved with Israel. The attacks have disrupted maritime traffic. In response, what's been called Operation Prosperity Guardian, OPG, mainly a U.S. British naval coalition, has launched seaborne airstrikes on Houthi positions and military assets in Yemen. To date, no member state of the Red Sea Forum has joined the OPG. Within this general context, let me briefly highlight the relative aims, nature, and implications of Somali piracy and Houthi attacks on security in the Red Sea. First, I will deal with the Somali piracy. Piracy in the high seas is as old as international shipping itself. It's nothing new. It's not particular to Somalia. Somali piracy began in the early 2000s due to several factors, including one, the collapse of central authority and the fragmentation of the state in Somalia. Two, the proliferation of illegal fishing and overfishing by foreign vessels in Somali waters. Three, the dumping of toxic waste on Somali waters. And four, the evolution of piracy into lucrative or profitable business. Somali piracy started as a defense against the pillage and exploitation of Somalia's fish resources and the dumping of toxic waste in Somali waters. I think it's very important to bear this fact in mind. It gradually evolved into big business and started operating very much like organized crime, hijacking ships, holding crews hostage, and demanding ransom became increasingly profitable. Given the power vacuum in Somalia, the devastation of the Somali coast by tsunami in 2004 gave rise to a patchwork of warlords and clan militias funding hijacking, deploying motherships and speedboats equipped with radar, GPS systems, and mobile phones. Millions of cash earned from ransom led to vast expansion of piracy and the creation of a burgeoning pirate economy, if one can say that. At its dens in 2011, piracy garnered about $150 million. In the beginning, it was difficult to fight piracy in the open seas by military means. In the end, however, it declined due to one, the operationalization of self-defense measures that were advocated or advised by the International Shipping Organization. Two, the creation of recognized corridors escorted by national navies. And three, the deployment of various naval armadas based in Djibouti, which they, of course, continue to exist. With this brief highlighting of Somali piracy, I come to the second issue, which is the implications of the Houthi attacks and Operation Prosperity Guardian strikes on the Red Sea security. The OPG strikes could, I think, in the first place, inflame existing tensions and instability in an already volatile region of the southern Red Sea. Second, they could disrupt the fragile peace in Yemen with dire regional consequences. Third, they could generate popular support for the Houthis and the defenders of the Palestinian cause, not only in the Arab street, but also in the global Arab and Muslim diaspora everywhere, and especially in the popular movements demanding ceasefire in Gaza. It could also reinforce the view that the U.S. is the main enemy enabling Israeli occupation of Palestine and the ongoing catastrophe of death and destruction in Gaza. Fifth, failure of the U.S.-British strikes and strikes to deter the attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea risks unraveling the U.S.-led order in the Middle East and further isolate the United States. Economically, continued U.S. Houthi confrontation in the southern Red Sea could, first, choke the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, disrupt or shut down international commercial shipping across the entire Red Sea. Second, divert global commercial shipping from the Red Sea around the Cape of Good Hope across the Atlantic. Third, increase freight costs and headline rates, which is insurance. Excuse me, somebody is calling. I should have. The fourth would be they would delay deliveries, raise commodity prices to and from. They could delay deliveries and raise commodity prices to end users, thereby fueling inflation and aggravating financial crisis already afflicting several economies. And the fifth would be significant revenue loss for Egypt, reduced shipping activity in the Suez Canal. Militarily, the US-British strikes against Houthi assets in Yemen are not working, at least so far. The strikes have not deterred Houthi attacks on international shipping. Airstrikes cause, of course, infrastructural damage, and human life. They kill people, but rarely deliver conclusive victory. The Houthis are battle-hardened with proven resilience during a decade of war in Yemen, as we all know. They could also be counterproductive and strengthen the military capability of the Houthi-led SPC as growing popular support in Yemen translates into increasing recruitment of fighters for the Houthi. Fourth would be continued attacks and strikes could escalate into US-British involvement in a wider regional conflagration they may not be able to win. And finally, in such an asymmetric warfare, and we have seen this most recently in Afghanistan, the US-British coalition could lose by not winning, and the Houthis could win by not losing. In conclusion, while Somali piracy was about money and power, the stated Houthi objective is solidarity with the Palestinian people in response to Israel's devastating war in Gaza. We all know that Israel is already on trial in the International Court of Justice for committing genocide. The quickest deterrence to the Houthi attacks would thus seem a cessation of hostility in Gaza, but in the long run, the end of occupation and the establishment of either a secular, democratic Israeli-Palestinian state or a viable independent Palestinian state secure within its 1967 borders would bring about a just and durable resolution to the Palestinian cause. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. الآن ننتقل للأستاذ مصطفى.
We'll now move on to Mustafa. Mustafa, could you please give us a quick overview of the impact that this has had on the international economy and international shipping, and specifically on Yemen's food and energy supplies and the port of Hudaydah? Go ahead, Mustafa. Thank you, Maysa. I enjoyed listening to the previous panelists, and I think their insights are very important. And I think some of it really explains what is happening. I will be focusing more on the economic aspect, but let me start with a fundamental point that one cannot truly separate what is happening in terms of the militarization of the Red Sea from the context of the current war in Yemen and what has been happening for over a decade in the race to control the Red Sea and secure a position there. Here, geopolitical reasons overlap with economic and other factors, and so it can be said that what is happening is both a cause and a result at the same time. What is currently happening, in my view, is a scenario that we were destined to reach, whether the events in Gaza occurred or not. This has been an ongoing process which began perhaps a decade or a little more than that ago, with actors aiming to secure a foothold on the Red Sea. And this started, like I said, a little over a decade ago. Consequently, in my opinion, one cannot separate what is happening in the global competition between the United States and its allies on one side, and China and Russia and the countries aligned with them on the other. Similarly, the race between, or the competition between Gulf countries on one side and Iran on the other. This may explain what is happening now, especially with the withdrawal over the past years, at least in the beginning of the last decade, when the United States partially withdrew from the Red Sea region and the Middle East in general. There were recommendations, for example, from the U.S. Institute of Peace in 2020, which predicted what would happen in the Red Sea and suggested a plan, or proposed a plan, to return to this region. Amid all of this, and this is the main focus of my intervention, is that Yemen pays the price for this conflict, depleting its resources and increasing the misery and poverty of its citizens. We know that Yemen is living in a tragic situation due to the war that is now approaching its ninth year, and over 80% of Yemenis are living in difficult humanitarian conditions. Unfortunately, recent events indicate a near complete closure of commercial activity in the Red Sea, whether due to the warnings from the United States or the numerous concerns from targeted operations that occasionally take place. Regrettably, things seem to be heading towards more escalation. Most recently, yesterday, the Qatari energy company, whose shipments used to pass safely, announced that it is reassessing the situation and may stop passing or shipping through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. In reality, we are facing a problem with geopolitical and security with significant economic ramifications, especially in a corridor through which 21,000 ships pass through annually, representing 12% of global trade, including 14% of oil exports. The direct repercussions on Yemen's economic situation begins with the rise in shipping and insurance costs to Yemeni ports. According to information we gathered at the Economic Studies and Media Center, the cost of shipping a container, for example, increased. A 40-foot container, which was around $5,000 is now over $10,000 for it to be shipped to the port of Hudayadh. The same applies to the port of Aden, where shipping prices to Yemen have increased by almost 100%. Or more than 100%, and it is expected to rise to 150% if the conflict continues to escalate. This directly impacts commodity prices. While it is true that the direct effects of these cost increases on commodity prices haven't been seen yet, they are expected to become more apparent in the coming months, especially for products that are imported to cover market needs and demand during the upcoming month of Ramadan. Current shipping operations are intended to fulfill the demand of the market during the month of Ramadan and beyond. And this affects all countries along the Red Sea, such as Egypt, Eritrea, Djibouti, and others. All countries who are heavily reliant on importing goods, particularly from China. We know that Egypt, for example, imports $14 billion worth of goods annually, and Yemen also heavily depends on goods imported through these regions. Another point is the increase in oil and gas prices, which, according to indicators, have risen by 4% so far. This directly affects the price of goods and services in Yemen and further exacerbates the economic burdens, especially since Yemen has completely halted the export of oil and gas due to the Houthi attacks last year on government-controlled oil export ports in Hadramaut and Shabwa. Furthermore, there is another direct repercussion of these events, which is the decline of traditional fishing, which a significant percentage of Yemen's population relies. Estimates indicate that approximately 1 to 1.5 million people depend on fishing activities, and there is now extreme caution in venturing out into sea for fishing activities due to the situation. The actual consequences will depend directly on what unfolds in the upcoming period. Will there be a complete closure, or will the diversion of ships out of the Red Sea decrease? Currently, estimates suggest that global shipping transportation through the Cape of Good Hope will be reduced or will be increased by no less than 80%. This means that approximately only 20% of shipping will continue to pass through the Red Sea. This will not only affect Yemen, but it will also affect Egypt, which has experienced a 40% decline in shipments heading towards its ports, according to statistics released in January. The main point or the conclusion that I would like to emphasize is that there is nothing substantial that can be relied upon to economically pressure the Houthis, at least economically. This has become evident through past experiences of the ongoing war, as well as in the group's clear stance. They do not care much about the halt of shipping through the port of Hudayadh, as they believe they can rely or that they can force the international community to support it through humanitarian activities. This was the case when battles approached the port of Hudaydah. It is evident that, according to our sources and shipping companies, some ships have been halted in Djibouti, for example, at the port of Djibouti, but they have been granted permission to enter the port of Hudaydah. Therefore, the shipping route to the ports of Aden and Hudaydah is now almost back to normal after the events or after the temporary halt, and these goods have now entered Yemen. Another point is that the negative effects will undoubtedly be felt in the medium term. These implications will affect the price of goods, including shipping costs, the cost of imported fuel, and many other commodities. In the long term, the Red Sea's reputation and the reputation of ports on the Red Sea will have been significantly damaged by the current events. I would like to conclude by stating that I disagree with some of the panelists regarding the gains that the Houthis will reap from these attacks. While it is true that when it comes to mobilization and recruitment within their areas, it has been stimulated and increased, but it depends on how the situation in Gaza goes or how it is resolved. But in my perception, I think that the poor economic conditions in Yemen, without any positive results being achieved in the Battle of Gaza, will, to the contrary, have a negative effect on the Houthis, because Yemeni citizens will be the ones paying the cost of this escalation if it leads to a total closure of the Red Sea. Some wonder if the port of there might be some questions, but we can go into details. Some have asked if the port of Hudaydah will be completely closed. I think that this is an unlikely possibility. However, I believe that the Houthis have tools to exert pressure on the international community under the pretext of humanitarian aid, and they will resort to measures that could compel the international community to provide a safe pathway for these ships, at least the ones carrying humanitarian assistance to the port of Hudaydah. That's my conclusion, and if there are any questions, I will happily answer them. Thank you very much, Mustafa. Thank you. I just wanted to inform everyone that the administration in the United States announced that it has classified the Houthis or reclassified them as a terrorist group. This is a question to you, Ms. Abdul Ghani. What are the implications of this designation to the peace agreement and the possibility of military escalation inside Yemen? It should be noted that a few days ago, Aidarus Zubaydi told The Guardian that Southern forces, or the forces of the Southern Transitional Council, were prepared to participate in any military attack on the Houthis. That is the first point. The second point that I wanted to clarify is with regards to the Gaza war. You mentioned and you linked the attacks by the Houthis to the Gaza war, and I think the connection is very clear, although some may downplay its threat to Israel because the port of Eilat is not Israel's main port. It only receives less than 5% of its external trade. It's true that the port of Eilat has been declined. Its activity has declined by 80%, but it is not Israel's primary port. And so the actual affected parties are Yemen, Egypt, and possibly other countries on the Red Sea, like Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Djibouti. And these countries only have ports on the Red Sea. Therefore, what would guarantee to the world that if the conflict in Gaza ends, or the war in Gaza ends, would this lead to an end to the Houthi attacks? Maybe it would, but after a year or two, for various reasons, whether because of Iran or Hezbollah being engaged in a conflict, what would guarantee that the attacks might resume? Could you also tell us more about the designation of the Houthis and the fact that the Southern Transitional Council said that they're prepared to fight? Does this mean that the military operations could expand, especially since the European Union announced that they are participating in this coalition for a year in these military operations? And so there's a possibility that this is a longer-term operation. The third question is, do you think that these attacks might resume even if the war in Gaza ends? Go ahead, Abdul Ghani. Thank you very much. First, with regards to the classification, there are two classifications. There's the FTO, Foreign Terrorist Organization designation, and the Specially Designated Terrorist Group designation. The Americans chose to classify the Houthis as a specially designated terrorist group, and there are legal differences in that it does not outright prohibit travel, it does not prohibit financial transactions and dealings as well as commercial dealings in the areas under their control. I'm definitely not a legal expert, but from what I understand, this is a much lighter designation when compared to the one used by the Trump administration, which would have would not hinder the peace negotiations and humanitarian aid. Sorry, but does this mean that the U.S. is still gradually escalating with the Houthis in the case that they return to attacking? Naturally. When it comes to this ladder of escalation, the United States cannot accept being engaged in blow for blow with them. Everything that the Houthis do will be met with a stronger response from the United States, even stronger than what they did before. This is the kind of escalation that will be carried out by the US as the stronger party, and this redesignation is a part of that escalation. But in reality, the Americans don't really have good options. If they punish them, they're punishing the people, and it will not weaken the Houthis. On the contrary, previous punishments have actually strengthened them, or previous sanctions have actually strengthened them and increased their ability to control and mobilize people. Therefore, I expect that when it comes to the legal measures, the redesignation will be the only action. However, in terms of the escalation, I am confident that the Americans will escalate militarily to stop the Houthis. The Houthis will not stop, and I anticipate that this will continue until the war in Gaza comes to an end. Regarding the possibility of them returning and repeating this again, this is for certain. And perhaps this will be what will change the calculus of Saudi Arabia. Because the situation cannot be stable in a state that is dominated by Ansar Allah. Other parties must have a strong influence inside Yemen so that they can balance out the extremism and adventurism of Ansar Allah in order to achieve a degree of stability that enables Yemen to return to a normal condition. Thank you. With regards to the Southern Transitional Council, if the STC becomes involved, does this imply the possibility of a broader war in Yemen? Some have said that this is a likely scenario, that if the Houthis do not cease their actions, it could lead to a prolonged military operation aiming to completely push the Houthis away from coastal areas. Is this possible? In my opinion, I don't think this is possible at this time, because the anti-Houthi camp has not been able to achieve even the minimum level of coordination, and this prevents them from executing a successful military operation. As for Zubaydi's statements, they may be for a longer-term purpose, but they are unlikely to bring about any significant change, either now or in the upcoming period where the nature of the peace in Yemen will be established. Thank you very much, Abdulghani.
Taimur, you have received a long question, and I have also a question for you. Can you explain to me how the Houthis continued receiving key components from the weapons they manufacture in Yemen during 9 years of blockade and siege in Yemen? Can you explain how this happened? And also the question from Jem Dingman, and it's a long one. What is the order of battle for Ansar Allah military forces? How well trained and capable are the units they have to interfere with shipping? I think this question is important because the Houthis, they engaged in a ground war, but never in the sea wars. I mean, to what extent they are really capable for this? How dispersed and robust are these capabilities? Is simply the use of air power and the strikes a deterrent factor for the Houthis, or simply an escalatory provocation? And finally, at this point, is their capability beyond simply relying on Iranian and Hezbollah advisors? Many questions.
Thank you for those questions. I mean, in terms of how are they able over 9 years of war and, more vigilant, I don't know about blockade, but more vigilant maritime security focused on, weapon flows into Yemen. Well, I mean, there's a robust kind of trafficking of not just weapons, but all kinds of illicit material into Yemen. Smuggling is a key part of, economies in especially during the conflict. So the incentives and the kind of role of illicit economy is more important. And there's also, we've seen greater integration. I think the ambassador Georgis was talking about kind of organized crime, greater integration of these groups that are linked to the Houthis involved in this, bring material from Iran and other places, as well as Somali actors and others in the Horn of Africa. So, I mean, I think it's not surprising that they were still able to source or be supplied with material from their supporters, even though there was, greater vigilance, more focus on the maritime security angle, more, a pretty steady tempo of interdictions of this weapons and material coming into the Houthis. But even then, I think we, can see now that was made a dent, but not enough to totally prevent them from building up their stockpiles. In terms of the other questions, I mean, I'll probably disappoint you. I'm not really an analyst of the Houthis or their, the kind of order of battle. I can talk more about the systems that they use, but I think even in the earlier days of the conflict with the Yemeni government and the Saudi coalition, they used and successfully used anti-ship missiles and waterborne IEDs or drone boats. That was not the focus of their, these were less frequent than now. But certainly they have those capabilities and have been, it's clear that they've been working to build them up. Whether they've, we don't, just from following, open source or, research that everyone has access to. I mean, it seems like it's likely that there were advisors from allies in the region at some point, but I don't think they're totally reliant. They've been at war for a long time, and they've gotten better at prosecuting, their war. And so, yeah, I mean, I can't add too much more than that.
Well, what's your assessment for the recent strikes? Are they really effective?
I mean, I think they're, some of them are interesting and show, kind of when there's U.S. or British military focus on preventing some of these strikes. A launch site was targeted reportedly successfully before a ballistic missile launch. So the types of, intelligence capabilities that the U.S. can bring to bear is quite different and probably much more effective than what was used during the conflict by the coalition. But again, I think it's all kind of not symbolic, but it won't have a strategic impact. The political capital and huge amount of resources required to keep this going and to have more of an impact. I think there's a big question mark over the ability of the coalition, of the U.S.-led coalition, to do that. The risk of escalation is I think is always there. I mean, we saw in 2022, Houthis were more than willing to target the UAE and U.S. allies in the region when they felt under pressure. And if I would assume that they would be even, kind of more effective at doing that, targeting U.S. bases, allies in the region, willing to escalate to a significant degree. So I think it's still, it's still, I think it's hard to say that they've, had a big impact so far.
When the EU declared that they are going to join a military operation that at sea for 1 year, does that mean that this military operation will continue for 1 year? So it will take long period?
I would assume so, but I don't know. I haven't read that statement. The EU NAVFOR, has been involved in the Red Sea. I'm not sure what role they would play beyond what the U.S., British, and French naval forces are already doing. But yeah, so I can't add too much more on that, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Andrew Burhan. Can you tell us about the countries that they don't have sea access except the Red Sea? For example, Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Djibouti. And do you think they will be affected? I mean, it is the only sea access for them. Is there any effective for them? Anything happened to them until now? And most of them, they are poor countries. They face famine, wars, and the second question is that we have this operation. It was actually aimed at the very beginning by the Houthis because they want to target Israel. And definitely most of the people in this region, they believe that the US interfered for the sake of Israel. So do you think countries like Eritrea and Ethiopia, and they are in good terms with Israel, they may do something like coalition in the Red Sea to defend their interests there? Or there is no possibility for these three countries? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Aisha. I think the first question, these countries, all of them, Sudan, Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia has access, of course, to the Indian Ocean and the Gulf of Aden, but Ethiopia is also dependent on it for access to its international trade on Djibouti. So the longer, if there comes a complete shutdown of the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, it will have very serious repercussions. First and foremost, these countries have internal crises. The Sudan is in civil war. In Ethiopia, there are wars almost in every regional state. Now, of course, the new so-called memorandum of understanding between Ethiopia and Somaliland is stirring up trouble between Ethiopia and Somalia. And in fact, that could possibly bring about some kind of coordination between Somali government and Al-Shabaab against, of course, what they see the Ethiopian threat, Somalia's territorial integrity and sovereignty, etc. So it'll be the whole idea of the fight against Al-Shabaab, which has been designated a terrorist organization, could in fact unravel. And so there's a new sense of uncertainty in the region. And if the international shipping is completely blocked, these countries, especially those which depend heavily on imports for their semi-finished or raw materials for their manufacturing industry, for food, for fuel, would be very seriously affected. It would aggravate the already prevailing economic problems, especially in Ethiopia, where there is famine and starvation in several regions, in the north in Tigray, in the south of Tigray, also in the Amhara regions, in the Afar and Somali regions. So I think the longer the problem in the Red Sea, the crisis in the Red Sea persists, the more the problems, the internal problems of these countries, the economic problems of these countries, which depend also on imported fuel, would be aggravated. And the second question is, of course, could you repeat that for me?
Yeah, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Israel, if they can make a coalition or something.
Well, these countries, to my understanding, have good relations, or amicable relations with both Israel and the states in the Arab world, the Arab countries. I'm not sure they have much leverage over Israel. I think the only country that can exercise effective leverage towards any desirable end is the United States, which seems quite reluctant to exercise, at least until this moment.
Okay, thank you.
Mustafa, with regards to the possibility of Hudaydah port being closed, this was a question that was debated during the military operation that was supposed to be launched by the coalition to take control of Hudaydah from the Houthis. If Hudaydah port is closed, there were many concerns about the grain silos and that this could cause a potential humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Could you please explain more about this? Additionally, there were questions about the potential impact on China's trade that passes through the Red Sea.
يعني نسبة تأثرها بالبراشوت حاليا.
The current situation
هذا هو السؤالين مبدئيا.
could affect its maritime trade. These are the first questions. I'll see if there are any further questions later on. Thank you, Mesa. With regards to the potential closure of the port of Hudaydah, which is located on the Red Sea, I disagree. I don't think it is likely unless the conflict escalates to its maximum intensity. As I mentioned, the Houthis control or let's say uses nearly the 2/3 of Yemen's population that it controls as hostages in this regard. Therefore, they have strong leverage over international organizations to ensure that the port of Hudaydah remains operational, at least for the import of basic goods and others. We are aware of the business undertaken by United Nations agencies, which are more eager than even the Houthis themselves to maintain these supply chains to the port of Hudaydah, especially considering the substantial amount of around $2 billion, which is significant for Yemen. That is why I consider this option unlikely. In reality, there are alternatives if such a scenario occurs. However, the Houthis also have leverage. The imports could be redirected through ports of Aden or Mukalla and other ports that have been operational even when container ships were not reaching the port of Hudaydah, with only limited items like wheat and others reaching the port. However, the Houthis allowed or turned a blind eye to these other ports and imposed levies, customs, and tariffs on the goods coming in from the areas under the control of the internationally recognized government. Now they have completely prohibited any goods that can be imported through the port of Hudaydah from being imported through ports outside of their control. Therefore, I rule out this possibility. The key point lies in the impact of rising commodity prices on civilians, whether in Yemen or in other countries along the Red Sea. Currently, the cost has not been paid yet by consumers because it is being paid by traders to shipping companies. The goods that are currently being imported will eventually reach markets after a period, and there will undoubtedly be negative consequences and effects that will exacerbate poverty and increase people's suffering. Regarding China, a significant portion of the imports to these countries comes from China, and it will definitely be affected. However, I think that the impact will not be significant, at least with regards to trade, because most goods will pass through the Cape of Good Hope, and with shipping being diverted there, the increase will be in the cost of shipping. I'm talking about goods that are heading to Europe and even to Egypt through the Mediterranean Sea and other routes. It will take a longer period, approximately 2 to 3 weeks. Sorry, Mustafa, I know that the increased costs will be borne by the consumer. However, is it possible that China will find it easier to continue exporting through other destinations? Because will Europe find it cheaper to import from other areas? One advantage of China is in its low-cost goods. Therefore, if the cost of these goods increases, it may become comparable to goods manufactured in Europe. I expect that the impact will not be that significant, not exceeding 20%. In any case, most European companies or factories have manufacturing facilities in China, and so they cannot afford to forego trade with China. The trade impact will not be significant. I believe that the impact may be more political in terms of control over the Red Sea passage, but as an economic operation, the impact will be limited. The major impact may be on consumers and the importers in these countries on the Red Sea, who will have to pay for the increased shipping and insurance costs. Regarding the classification of the Houthis as a terrorist organization, will this impact remittances from expats? This is a question from Bilqis Al-Lahabi. Another question from Salah. Will it directly affect the movement of ships within the port of Hudaydah? I will start with the last question about the impact on the activity of ships. So far, there have been delays, and some ships were delayed or detained in Djibouti when there was an escalation in the conflict and significant threats. However, they were eventually allowed to pass. And based on the statistics that we have been able to gather on the Red Sea ports, specifically Hudaydah port, ships are still flowing there, albeit at a slightly lower rate, but movement is still relatively normal. Regarding the classification of the Houthis, it depends on the nature of the classification and the details or legal ramifications associated with it. In any case, there will be effects, particularly on the banking sector and on remittances. It is evident that the Houthis have gained a strong grip on the banking sector, and there are even factions within the group that control or have strong influence over certain banks. This will raise many questions, or it will pose further obstacles and challenges to remittances, whether from expatriates or various financial transfers, and even for international organizations operating in areas under Houthi control. There will undoubtedly be an impact, but the extent of this impact depends on the level and details of this designation. Thank you very much, Mustafa.
To Ambassador Under Burhan, there is a question from Maggie. Do you see impact of the current conflict in the Red Sea on dynamics in the Horn of Africa, especially after Ethiopia latest deal in Somaliland and the ongoing war in Sudan with RSF, possible takeover of Port Sudan? Do you think Houthis can be used by any of these governments' factions to impose a different status quo in the Horn? It's a big question.
What we're seeing at the moment is what seems to be a new realignment of regional forces. You have the rapid support forces in Sudan, which seem to be aligned regionally with the United Arab Emirates, and of course Ethiopia leaning towards that, and west of Sudan, some of the countries. And then you have, of course, the armed forces of Sudan, Eritrea, Somalia, aligned more and more with Egypt and Saudi Arabia. In a region where the axiom of the enemy of my enemy is my friend operates, it's really difficult to predict what kind of shifts would come in there, whether this seemingly new realignment would really materialize, or there will be shifts, rearrangements among the alliance members in each group. We don't know. I think we have to just wait and see.
Okay, thank you. Actually, the time is finished, but I need one last sentence or recommendation from everyone. It's it's a lot of questions. I'm very sorry for the people who posted the questions, especially for Abdelghani Al-Iryani. And I want Abdelghani Al-Iryani to give us a recommendation. Also, give us a last clarification about the Houthis and how they use this leverage in their negotiation with the Saudis. What is the end game for the Houthis? Because they refuse to share power with the Yemenis. And also they keep threatening that they are going to escalate on the ground and on the sea. So can you clarify to us what is the end game here? It's a big question, but if you can answer it quickly and give us a recommendation.
Clearly, the end game is to snatch a deal with Saudi Arabia so that they will be the dominant power in Yemen. And this is going to be a temporary thing because of course, their ambitions are much greater than Yemen. So the Saudis will not really get the security that they hope for by making a deal that keeps the Houthis as the dominant power in Yemen. The other forces, they're too weak and divided. They won't be able to negotiate an equitable, balanced deal. So my recommendation is, if you want stability in the region, there has to be balance between the two sides so they could reach an equitable and durable peace settlement. And do not think that fighting the Houthis again will make them weaker. It probably won't, because they are battle-hardened and the forces opposite them are divided. But you can strengthen the anti-Houthi camp so the Houthis will see the wisdom of entering into good faith peace negotiations that produces a viable peace settlement.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Andarbahan, if you have any recommendation, any last sentence?
Very well. Actually, I kind of agree with the last statement that there will either have to be a deal somehow balanced, taking the interests of all parties into account, or failing that, there might be an ignition of the civil war, which God forbid. In terms of the Horn of Africa, I think the main problem is the problem that is provoking increasing instability in the region is the Ethiopian Prime Minister's demand for ownership of access to the sea rather than of use of access to the sea. Landlocked countries can have access to the sea within the framework of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which allows them access to the sea for their for their foreign trade, while respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the transit countries. So part of this is, of course, the newly agreed so-called Memorandum of Understanding, which is igniting problems between Somalia and Ethiopia, and also could spread to the rest of the region. So I think Ethiopia needs to abide by international law and have a satisfy its legitimate need for access to the sea, not through ownership, but through use under, of course, international law.
Thank you so much. Taimur?
Thank you. Yeah, no, I would just say, I think there is, as the Houthis inevitably need to resupply in terms of the kind of key components for the strategic systems that we discussed. I mean, there's an opportunity to do a better job of making a dent in their ability to source and receive that material. But I think key and, it's really strategic component of that undertaking is greater support. I guess I'm speaking to kind of, international community, donor governments for Yemeni Coast Guard, border security, customs agencies. In the medium term, they're going to play a key role in that effort. And we've had cases, very successful cases related to this, where in Coast Guard, customs were essential to the kind of on the ground piece of that. And I would, when the international community's focus quickly leaves Yemen and resources quickly are not available, it has I think, a really counterproductive effect. So that would be my last sentiment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mustafa, do you have any additions or recommendations you would like to add? Actually, the economic issue is closely linked to the political and security issues. I believe that there is a real will in the international community to resolve the matter. It can be resolved one way or the other. However, in my opinion, this will, these are unavailable, or there is significant inconsistency in it. Yemen will continue to bear the cost of this geographic curse, the curse of being located in this important region of the world, a location that it has only suffered from with recurring conflicts from time to time. But we hope for a genuine peace in Yemen, a fair and balanced peace, as mentioned by Abdul Ghani. While this may seem far-fetched now, we still remain hopeful. Thank you all very much. I apologize for the large number of unanswered questions. Thank you very much, everyone. I would like to thank the panelists and the attendees. See you in another seminar organized by the Sana'a Center. Goodbye.